who on earth we are. So first of all, just before we get into the meat of this evening's session, give you a bit of background to who we are, and it is very brief, but just to make sure you're aware of what we are and what we do. We are an organisation that specialises in writing CVs and providing people with extra products and services to help them get through the job hunting process. So that's CVs to get interviews, and then interview coaching to get the job, hopefully. So there are two distinct phases to the process. Anybody who still thinks the CV gets you the job, you should disarm yourself of that fact, because the CV is there to get you the interview, and then there are a whole host of other things that get you the job. We'll talk a little bit about what makes an effective CV, of course, but we'll also talk about how to evaluate that. How do you know whether your CV is doing the job it should be or not? We'll touch on that shortly as well. In terms of me personally, and indeed many of the team within the business, I have a corporate background first, then I moved into recruitment for my sins, then I worked for Matt within the CV and Interview Advisors. I've reviewed CVs and still do that, and also write CVs. So I've seen the process from lots of different angles, and for any of those people who are not really familiar with how a CV gets treated these days, how recruiters use them, the amount of time and attention that they give you your CV, you might have some clues and thoughts about that, but we'll touch on some of the realities this evening as well, because that's quite important. So I'd rather hope that whatever your opinion of my views is, they at least come from some base point of knowledge, rather than I just woke up one morning and thought it would be a good idea to write CVs. I've seen it from quite a few different angles, and I'll try and pass on some of that knowledge. Other people within our business have a similar kind of background. Interestingly, one of the things that we found works really well when we're writing CVs for our clients, potentially people like you, a couple of our writers are published authors in their own right. That will become it'll become apparent how important that is later on in this evening's session. And crucially, one of the things that you or somebody on your behalf would need to understand, particularly in the current climate, is the importance of what we call hot skills. That's a bit of a cliche, but what's important in your marketplace right now. So if you're in sales, what part of sales, what part of the sales process, what type of sales is important? If you're into project management, what qualifications ought you have? What are the things that are topical right now that employers are tending to look for? And they're often expressed as being essential or desirable skills. And the essential ones, you'd be surprised how much compromise exists around them, despite the fact they're labelled as essential. And the desirable ones, sometimes you'd be surprised that actually they don't really mean desirable, they mean essential. So understanding that is quite important, and we know that because we work with an awful lot of people, and so we get to find out what works and what doesn't. But that's really important if you're writing a CV. Sounds a bit aggressive. In this current climate, again, I keep stressing the current climate because it is tough out there, and there are lots of people applying for jobs. There are more jobs than there were 2 or 3 years ago in most sectors, that's a fact, but there are also an awful lot of people chasing those jobs. And it's not just people who are looking for work because they're out of work, it's people who are looking to make a move because they've had no salary increase for a good few months or years, and so the only way to improve their situation is to move jobs. And you're finding that an awful lot of people who are trying to move jobs. And so that creates a lot of competition. And as we'll see later, if your CV isn't communicating the right message to your target audience, your potential employers and recruiters and such like, then you're on the back foot automatically. So as much as you can with a document, then you really do need to make sure it counts, and then in the few seconds you've got of somebody's time and attention during those critical first few moments of an application, that you're sending the right message, a message that ultimately will get you an interview rather than a rejection. We're going to take a brief look now at what a CV actually is, and you may think, well, big deal, how important is that? Well, it's actually really important, because a lot of the mistakes people make, and going back to the headline of this session this evening, debunking myths about CVs. A lot of people start bad, and then their CV evolves over time and just keeps getting worse rather than better. So historically, and you'll know whether you're guilty of any of these things or whether your CV currently features any of these things, but historically people have approached their CV as being a list of jobs, qualifications, contact details, all sorts of things, hobbies, interests, referees, and such like. And you might think, well, what's the harm in that? Well, we'll come on to that in a minute. If you've ever been asked to or applied for a job, particularly within the public sector and particularly within the NHS or local authorities, and increasingly large-scale employers in the private sector, you may be familiar with the fact or have had to fill out an application form. And if you think back to those, depending on how recently you had to fill out an application form, invariably most candidates find them a bit of a challenge because, rather frustratingly, the application forms tend to ask for things that wouldn't ordinarily be on your CV. And for those that are familiar with them, they tend to be prefaced by questions like, please give an example of the last time that you did insert a phrase. And so whatever their employer's looking for, they'll tend to ask a question about it. And the other catch-all or common denominator is that these questions then tend to have a limit on how much answer you can give. So often it'll be, give us an example of such and such an event in less than 250 words, or less than 500 words, or in less than 1,000 characters, or something like that. Why are employers asking you for that information when it's not already on your CV? Well, exactly that reason. It's not already on your CV. Employers, particularly large-scale ones, get so many applicants for their jobs, they cannot afford to sit down and look at CVs, which their view would be invariably fail to provide the information they're looking for. So they, and a lot of people in their camp, are incredibly frustrated with the quality of CVs. They very rarely feed this information back to the candidates, which isn't particularly helpful. So the candidates keep producing a CV that's basically just a list of things. The employer's looking for actual evidence to support the ability of the individual to do the job. And so in frustration at the lack of quality CVs, they say, right, we'll design a form which applicants will have to fill out. It will capture the information we're really after, and then we can make a proper decision and a judgment on who to interview and who not to interview. So that's why employers often go down the application form route. They're forcing candidates to provide the information they actually want. So then you can ask yourself the question, is my CV providing that information or not? And invariably, they're not. The trouble is, very few employers will feed that information back. They might tell their recruiters, if they're using one, and some recruiters will tell you that your CV is not effective, but most will find another convenient way of explaining why you didn't get an interview, which often isn't actually the truth, which is, again, frustrating, but happens. So just following a list is a bad thing, you'll be gathering now. The other bad thing, if you're adopting this style, is that if you've still got a CV that effectively follows the same format as it did when you left school, college or university, and all you've done is top it up over time, then you're probably on the back foot already, because it will just look tired and old, and it won't be presenting the information that most people want. Most people, not all, most people tend to write a CV. It then gets more and more informative as they add a few jobs to it. But of course, if you just keep on adding jobs, your CV gets longer, more rambling, and there comes a point at which, depending on the length of experience that you have, that it becomes totally useless to mention things that happened 8, 9, 10, 12, 15, 20 years ago. There's just no point. What happened in that period of time, those kind of double-digit years onwards, is of no material interest to a recruiter or an employer making that quick interview decision. It might be useful for the bigger picture when they decide to employ somebody, or second interview stage or interview stage, when they're wanting to talk a little bit more about what makes you tick and what you've been up to. But to make that initial decision about whether you get an interview or not, you don't need to be delving up the past. So if all you're doing is adding to your CV every time you get a job, and sometimes people get a bit tired of doing that, so what should be their most important information, their recent job, gets the least attention, then that's a big no-no as well, and will be damaging your prospects and chances. So if you're guilty of that, start to think, oh dear, I need to do something about this. If there's one message you should take away from this evening, and there are probably a handful in fairness, if I were able to give you best practice advice, but one of the most important, possibly the most important message is that rather than this list of things, your CV should present a strong business case as to why somebody should hire you. And you need to start thinking yourself crudely as a product or a service, which you are in effect. You need to start thinking yourself as being quite an expensive product or a service. Almost at whatever level of job you're operating at, it's going to be tens of thousands of pounds of somebody's money invested in you as an individual. Again, in the current climate, that's always been true, I think, but particularly in the current climate, it's certainly true. You need to be presenting your target audience with some kind of idea as to what investment return they're going to get, or return on their investment they're going to get, by sinking a few £1,000s into you. And if you're a contractor, a few £100 a day, or whatever your rate is. So it's really important that you start to think of yourself not just as here's a list of things that I've done, but actually as a product or service, a solution to somebody's problem. Again, a bit of a cliche, but I'm afraid it's true. Why should somebody hire you? What's differentiating about you? What's different? What are you going to bring to their particular party? So you'll have gathered a bad CV, crudely, is just a list of things. So if all you're presenting your audience with is a list of jobs that you've had, duties and responsibilities that you've performed, qualifications that you have, you're not in the realms of the best practice CV writing ability. You're in the Me Too's, the average, the mediocre. A good CV, therefore, is a business case. It's a document which explains to your audience why they should be considering hiring you, and more particularly in the first instances of recruitment, why they should be interviewing you to consider hiring you. So that's message number one, if you like, and really important. We'll come on to some examples of what makes a good CV and how you build this business case very shortly. The other thing that's changed a lot in recent years, of course, is the advent of electronic means of storing your information. CVs have been stored on various databases for a long time now, but the really important thing that's developed is the ability for people to find you through means other than just picking you out of a filing cabinet or out of a crude list of CVs that somebody's stored on their hard drive. And this all revolves around the use of keywords. So just as you use Google or some search engine to find things these days, there'll be recruiters and employers up and down the land, across all countries, typing in various phrases, words, characteristics that they're looking for, and your CV will either appear or not, as the case may be. So an awareness of what those keywords are, the phrases, the actual words, the terminology being used, is quite important. And also an awareness that actually a lot of people, just like if you've used Google or any other search engine, some of you out there will, if you're looking for to buy a car, you'll literally just enter maybe the brand or the model name, or something like that. Others will know how to do quite fine-tuned, well-defined searches using Boolean logic within Google's little homepage, and presumably Bing, you can do the same kind of thing. There'll be all sorts of different levels of awareness on how to use the tools available at the user's disposal. And so you'll get recruiters who are new, fresh, young, inexperienced, and they'll treat the search engine just as they would Google when they first used it. Then you'll get more experienced, creative people who'll search really well. They'll be able to really fine-tune the search. You need to build your CV with both targets in mind. The people who don't really know what they're doing and the people who do, and you still need to appear in both of their lists. Again, we'll touch on that a bit later. I mentioned earlier that I'd give you a little bit of a clue in terms of how to work out whether your CV is working or not. And it isn't particularly clever to say, but a lot of people don't do the maths. And for those that have got the evidence at their disposal, they fail to see the critical link, which is the CV. So the acid test, second important message, if you like, of the evening, acid test for the CV is it actually getting you interviews? And if it isn't, It is the CV pretty much that's at fault, nothing else. There are a few exceptions to that rule, but they're rare. So generally speaking, if you've got 10 jobs that you know you could perform and you've applied to them, and based on the evidence at your disposal, you think you could perform those jobs. So again, I'm talking about people if they're a project manager, they're going for project manager, senior project manager, program manager type roles. If they're a teacher, you're going for more senior roles, similar subject roles, head of department roles, whatever. But if you're a salesperson and you're looking to become, as I said earlier, a nuclear submarine captain, realistically, it doesn't matter how many times you apply, you're not going to get anywhere. Anybody who's listened to the news today, actually, there seems to be an exception to all. The chairman of the Co-op Bank seems to have done very well at becoming the chairman of the Co-op Bank without actually having anything to do with finance or anything more relevant in his background and experience. So there are always exceptions to the rule, which are frustrating. But generally speaking, you've got to be able to justify why you're applying for a role. And if you feel hand on heart you could perform that role and you're applying to, say, 10 of those roles, if you're getting no interviews, there's a problem, of course. If you're getting 8, 9, 10 interviews, your CV is doing grand, a fine job. And to be honest, it's probably not at the stage where anybody, including ourselves, is going to materially help you make an improvement on that. So you can start to do the stats. If you're in the 1, 2, 3 out of 10 interviews, again, it's the CV's causing a problem somewhere. You should be getting a higher hit rate. And if you're in that sort of grey area, 5, 6, 7 out of 10 interviews out of 10 applications, then it is a bit of a grey area. It really depends on what kind of success rate you're having beyond that from those interviews. Are they sufficient to get you traction and ultimately a job? Again, what I encourage people to do is not to burn too much time applying for jobs and then just wondering whether the stats will magically change. Most people don't have the luxury of lots of jobs to apply for, and then to 3 months later sit down and do the analysis and say, yeah, that guy who was on the webinar the other evening 3 months ago was actually right, my CV is rubbish. Now 3 months later I think I'll actually do something about it. Most people don't have the luxury of that time. So if you've got a small amount of evidence, your interviews aren't up to spec, you don't feel that you're getting enough interviews for the jobs you should be getting interviews for, it is the CV. Nobody knows you from Adam. If they do, that's even more worrying, actually. If people do know you and should be representing your interests to the client directly, and they're not, that's a bigger problem still. In most cases, recruitment these days is a fairly impersonal, not in all cases, but generally a fairly impersonal process. So you're not known to any great degree by the people you're dealing with, and you're probably not known by the client who's doing the recruitment, the employer. So the only judgment they can make about your validity for interviewing is what you send them in your CV or what you've got on LinkedIn, or a combination of the two, which is why we're going to be talking about LinkedIn later. So although I'm sorry for going on about this, but it is really, really important that you don't spend too much time blaming other factors. Got nothing to do with the economy. If there is a job to apply for, you can do it. You sent the CV, you don't get an interview. That's to do with your CV, not to do with the economic situation. You might be up against lots of people. That is to do with the economic situation. But if you're a valid applicant, you've got the skills and competencies, you know you can do the job, you should still be getting an interview. Or your chances of getting an interview out of 10 of those applications should be far higher if your CV is doing its job. If it's not doing its job, you won't get the interviews, and it is as black and white as that. The next challenge is, what's going wrong with the CV, and we've started to touch on some of those reasons. It's probably because you're not presenting a business case to your target audience, and we'll touch on how to fix that very shortly. So acid test, number 2 big message of the evening is do those stats, keep an eye on it, and then you know whether to act or not. Now, what people tend to ask as the evening and these webinars unfold, and sometimes they ask us many days, weeks, months later, when they've gone through the pain of having made applications and not getting interviews, is, okay, so you guys, you say you write a CV that can knock down doors. what kind of stats have you got to prove it? Well, it is very difficult. It is very personal. But generally speaking, whether you've got a CV written by us, by anybody else doing a good job, or whether it's yourself that's done it, a good CV should materially improve your chances, and a good CV should be in the double digits, substantial double digit level of percentage increase in success rate. So a material difference. So it's not all smoke and mirrors, it's not all fluff and nonsense. It's hard proof that if you get the CV well targeted to your audience, you will get a better result. We don't really touch on this much during the evening, but don't be under any impression or thought that people writing your CV will make you out to be something that you're not. Obviously, that's not what a good CV is. It's not a document where you should be falsifying anything, enhancing anything beyond your capability, taking you on a sort of egotistical road trip or any nonsense like that. You know, a good CV is, as I keep saying, a business case as to why somebody should hire you. Now, lurking behind that implicitly means that you've got to be able to prove it, and we'll be talking about that as well this evening. So what we're not trying to do is make any case whatsoever for enhancing things or making you superhuman when that's not deserved. What we are talking about is, if you like, deconstructing all the things that you've done, looking at what your target audience is actually interested in, and then reconstructing all that raw data into something meaningful which makes sense to your target audience. And you'll be staggered how many times we have conversations with individuals interested in getting their CV rewritten who almost under their breath mention something absolutely fundamental that they've totally ignored, totally forgotten, totally undervalued, but is almost the key to why they're not getting interviews. Because they're so close to what they've done in their lives, they've forgotten what's important, what their target audience is actually looking for, or they've assumed, because of who they've worked for, or because of the level of their job, that whoever's reading the CV must know by some divine providence that they have the skills capable of performing the role. And you'll be surprised how often that's not the case, simply because you've got to consider who's doing that initial filtering of your CV, and it's often not somebody who's best placed to make that decision, ironically. So more of that later, but two key messages there: build a business case for your audience and measure the stats of interviews to job applications. And the sort of subtext of that is, you get your document right, you get more interviews, and it's as simple as that. Okay, now we move on to the structure of the CV and how we would write a typical CV for one of our clients that we know produces results. And we start off with what we call a professional or executive summary. Many of you may have these, and you may have had feedback. And before I started getting involved in CV writing, I had to be truthful, a negative view of these kind of opening statements for a number of reasons, but we'll touch on why shortly. But it is important, if you go back to this main cause, building a business case, that you start somewhere and you start to sow the seed in your target audience's mind of what it is that you have to offer them. Shortly, when I've gone through a few of the sections on the CV, I'll show you a real-life example of how we actually produce the document and the content on it. So I will come back to that. And I should have mentioned right up front that a recording of this whole session will be available tomorrow, and you'll be sent a link giving you access to it if you want to revisit any part. So you'll get that as part of the post-webinar service. So as I say, I will come back to a real-life example. In this opening statement, so just imagine your CV, page 1, at the top of the page, pretty much ahead of everything else other than who on earth you are, which we'll come on to in a bit. What are you? And you might think, well, big deal. How revolutionary is that? And of course, it isn't. It's very simple, but you'll be surprised how many people don't make it very clear to their audience what on earth they are. So if you carry a particular title that's generic, like project manager, state that you're a project manager. If the job is recruiting a project manager and it's a generic title, okay, your job title may not be precisely project manager, but basically what you're trying to do is reflect to your audience that you are what they're looking for. I'll come on to why that's important in a minute. Again, a bit of a cliche, I'm afraid, but what is your value proposition and what does that mean? Well, in a sense, remember this amount of money that's going to be invested in you. This ought to be the start of, okay, I've told you what I am, so what I'm saying is that I'm a valid applicant for the job. I'm not somebody who's just been making cars when actually the job is to sell beer. I'm not an invalid applicant for the job. I'm a valid applicant for the job. So making it clear to your audience that you deserve to be considered properly. You're then suggesting, or should be suggesting, that you know that that job is going to be remunerated to a certain level. You need to be suggesting pretty quickly the return on that investment, or starting to sow a seed about the return on that investment you have to offer your potential employer. So what's your value proposition? What are the things that you can do that are worth something to your potential employer? Linked to that are a handful of things that most people are particularly good at. Now, these summaries can be written for anybody at any level. It doesn't matter whether you're a checkout operator at a supermarket or convenience store or a CEO of a major multinational global organization. It doesn't matter. Everybody has got a what are they, the Ron Seal kind of moment, if you like. What does it say on the tin? That's what you are. Everybody has something that they're able to offer a return on. So if somebody was to pay you an amount of money, you can give a return on that amount of money. Everybody's got that. And then most people then have got lurking under that 3, 4, 5 really strong things that they're normally particularly good at, or a couple of things. It doesn't really matter on the number, but most people are particularly good at certain things within the jobs they've been doing. And you need to bring these out pretty quickly on the first part of the CV. Going back to a comment I made earlier, it's really important that you link these things to the hot skills in the marketplace and or what that employer is looking for. So this is an area where you tend to try and mirror what the employer is looking for with what you've got to offer. Now, of course, it implies, therefore, that you've generally got real achievements, competencies, abilities that fit what the marketplace is after. So this, again, it reinforces the fact that you can't be going for any old job. You've got to be going for something that makes sense of and makes use of what you're good at, what your competencies are. But most people tend to do that, self-evidently. So all this is suggesting is that you link your hot skills with your skills, the hot skills in the marketplace, with the skills that you have to offer the marketplace. So knowing what they are is important. Here's an example. Again, don't worry about the level or the title per se. You can write this for anybody. I won't read it out word for word. You can read it for yourselves. But I'll just highlight a couple of things. First of all, the what are you? Well, in this particular case, you can quite clearly see that the person is an experienced finance director. So there's somebody operating at a senior finance level, and they have board experience. So that's the what are you. The value proposition bit is sort of linked to the second half of the first sentence, which is a track record of embedding robust financial governance, blah, 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 to protect cash flow and profitability. So those are the things that would be considered as this particular person's value proposition. Okay, it's the best way, unfortunately, to describe basically their key offering to the world, where they can add most value. The what are they particularly good at are what follows after the key strengths include, and then there's a whole list of things. Now, the critical bit here is it's a list of things that's relevant to the people in the marketplace, possibly even the job itself. It's not just a random list of things that this particular person thought they were good at that has no relevance in the marketplace. And interestingly, you'll notice, and this is where most people get it hideously wrong, there's no reference to all the behavioural things that I guess most people tend to focus on. So there's no talk of communication skills, interpersonal skills, enthusiasm, dedication, commitment, dynamism. There's nothing about the objective that this individual has personally, because that's sort of me. It's suggesting that this individual is A, in the right space, they're a senior financial person, that they can offer a particular return on the investment that might be made in them that is critical, protect cash flow and profitability, and not many people are going to argue with that as being a value proposition. That's pretty important. That they're good at a whole host of things that we're assuming for the purposes of this evening are relevant to the marketplace. I mean, they certainly sound it, but let's just assume that they're linked quite well to what is in demand right now, and possibly even specifically for the role that this person applied for, they're highly relevant. But they're not talking about anything to do with the individual and all the woolly things that they might have that are totally impossible to prove on a CV. So if you've got an opening statement that makes any reference to working in a team as well as an individual, or being an individual, having great interpersonal skills, being enthusiastic, being committed, dynamic, passionate, excellent, overachieving, and you'll know whether you've got any of these things in your opening statement. If you have them, they are hurting you, because most people go to market with them. And you then may say, well, if most people are going to market with them, what's the harm? And that's the point. If you're a recruiter and you've got 100 CVs to look through, how on earth do you decide who is the most enthusiastic person purely from a CV? You can't. So your eyes glaze over and you look for something else to make a decision on. That's what happens. And you've probably got 5 to 20 seconds of somebody's time if there are a fair few applicants for a job. Anything more than 30, 40 applicants, and some jobs these days are getting hundreds of applicants, even at quite a senior, sophisticated level, or in specialist marketplaces. You'd be surprised how many applicants are out there. Whether they're relevant is a wholly different question, and in a way doesn't really matter at this stage. That CV's still got to be looked at by somebody, even if it takes them 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 seconds to judge that they're a time waster. Somebody's still got to make that decision and do something with it. And the trouble is, if all your CV conveys is an impression that you're another time waster or me too, or somebody that's not got anything relevant to say, you'll be discounted in that first few seconds. And you may actually technically be a really good applicant for the job. And that's a sad thing. What then happens, jumping ahead slightly in terms of the process, but let's assume there are 100 applicants. Let's assume that 30 or so of them are total time wasters. They're heaved out of the system pretty quickly. There are always a few casualties, if you like, so there'll be a few others, maybe 10 or 15 that get accidentally rejected because they just had an ineffective CV. So you've whittled it down to roughly half the number of CVs you started with. Still leaves you with 40, 50 documents to have to do something with. So then you're looking for people that at least, okay, they look valid, but there's no proof to back up what they're saying, so they get discounted pretty quick. Recruiters trying to look, or the HR people are trying to whittle this big number of applicants down to a meaningful number, probably under 10 if there's just one position going, something south of 10 as a rough indicator, so that they can then make a decision on who to bring forward to interview. And they probably wouldn't interview 10 either. Ideally, most people are probably looking to interview somewhere between 3 and 5 individuals, maybe sometimes more, maybe even sometimes less. But yeah, to whittle down the 100 to a handful. And they want to do that pretty damn quickly because it's competitive out there for good people. So your CV's got to somehow communicate that you're A, a valid applicant, B, that you've got something to offer the world, C, that it's relevant to your target audience, and that therefore they should be seeking to interview you as one of that handful. And you've got to do that within the 20 or so seconds somebody might have initially given your CV. So if you've got a statement about how wonderfully enthusiastic you are and the fact that your career objective is whatever it is, it's not going to do the job more times than not, I would suggest. Now, you may know this already if you've experienced the pain, but if you're just embarking on the job search, just bear that in mind. It's necessary to be far more specific and relevant out there. So this kind of opening statement helps you in that cause. And makes and starts to build this business case as to why somebody should hire you. So avoid the behavioural stuff, avoid the adjectives, focus on the functional and the provable content. Interestingly, you remember I mentioned that some of our authors, or CV writers, are published authors, and that people like us exist. Well, if you hopefully started to think, I've got to think myself as being a business, as a product or a service, particularly if any of you are contractors and offering your wares to the world, start to think and consider that maybe you aren't the best person to write your CV. A lot of people start off understandably with the premise that they're the person doing the work, they've lived their lives, surely they're the best people to write about it. Well, absolutely, in terms of providing the raw content, you are. Nobody can guess what you've been up to. You know what you've been up to, you know what you've been doing. But interestingly, most people don't write a good CV themselves because it's a skill. It's like any other skill. Pretty much like, if you wanted to do something specific, if you want to get your car fixed, most people tend not to fix their own cars. They take them to a specialist. Most people tend not to fix their own dishwasher or washing machine. They get somebody out to do it. And the same is true of CV writing, although it's much harder to get people to realise that until they've been through the pain of getting poor results with their own CV. And it's a bit like the comparison between, hence the note at the bottom of this slide, websites and companies. Most companies don't go out and just invent their own website, slap it up one day and then let it do its work. They get people in to sort it. And you need to start thinking perhaps that you are a product or a service. You need to be better represented in the marketplace. And then if you get across that hurdle, particularly if you've had the pain of not getting enough interviews, who can help you? Well, at least part of the answer is there are people like us who can help you. So at least that's part of the solution to a problem if you have that problem. If you're getting the 7, 8, 9, 10 interviews out of 10 applications, as I say, you probably should go off and have your tea or do something more interesting because your CV is doing its job. Okay, so just quick recap. We started off with describing the top part of the CV, a professional or executive summary. And we said this is where you're starting to build a business case. Why should somebody hire you? What are you good at? What's your value proposition? And indeed, what are you at a base level? As I promised, shortly I'll show you an example of a CV structured in this way. My next suggestion is that, and to deal with part of the issue we talked about earlier, which is the way CVs are stored these days, is that you have a section which we tend to call key skills or areas of expertise or something similar. Again, what you call it doesn't really matter, but it's what's in it that matters. And this is a menu of all the relevant key skills that you have that people might search for. And why is that important? Because these days, SEO, search engine optimization, is really important, and your CV, as soon as it leaves you, will get stored in a number of ways. So you're more than likely applying over the internet. As soon as you do that, you're landing on somebody's database, be that a job board or an employer's database that they've got set up because you've applied directly to the employer, or an intermediary of some sort, possibly like a recruiter. All of these people have their own systems. So if you applied via, I don't know, Monster or Reed, as soon as you do that, of course you have to upload your CV. That gets stuck on their system. Employers and recruiters have access to Monster, pay people like that a lot of money to get access to the database. Even if they don't advertise, they can still get access to the database and use it to find people for their businesses, or recruiters can find people for their clients. So that's one area. The recruiters themselves are almost likely to have their own database, an internal database. Might not be linked to the outside world, but it will be used for their consultants, however large or small they are, and that will use some other kind of technology. It'll be another place your CV is stored. There's LinkedIn, of course, whether you've actually got a document on there or whether you actually got a profile that looks remarkably like your CV, which actually is probably not such a clever thing. We'll come on to that later, but of course that's another place. Then the employers themselves, once they've had your application, either from a recruiter or a job board, are likely to have, particularly if they're a big employer, their own candidate tracking system, application tracking system they're often called, or some device that will store your details yet again for access within their business. So all these places your CV is stored means that then all these people have access to it, but normally it's done via some kind of search mechanism, like we were talking about earlier. So they'll type in keywords, phrases, and hopefully up your CV will pop in front of them. So it obviously goes without saying that you need to have those phrases and key skills and words on your CV, otherwise it won't work very well. And again, lots of people miss that trick and have the wrong kind of phrases and jargon that they use in their own business, but means nothing outside of the world they live in at the moment. So it's important to get a list of these things on your CV, and here's a few examples just coming up on the screen. Again, I won't read through all of them, but the CV would look pretty much like that. Again, I'll show you an example, probably somewhere between 5 and 7 bullet points on the left and 5 and 7 balancing it on the right. So between 10 and 14 separate skills listed on the CV right at the top. And this is a great area if you've got a particular level of qualification, not so much education, but things like Prince 2 project management, if that means anything to any of you, that would go here. ACCA accounting qualification, that could go here. But things like project management, business process re-engineering, post-acquisition implementation, blah, 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 all the key skills, things that people do search for, it's a great area to put them on the CV. Visually it works well because people like the reassurance that you've got experience or are alluding to the fact you've got experience in certain areas, but electronically works really well because this is an area that will get indexed by all the databases. So if people type in these kind of phrases, you'll have a greater chance of appearing higher up their list. So really important. Now, note at the bottom of this slide may at first glance seem, again, incredibly obvious, but lurks within it a message, again, that's important. So the message there, 92% of recruiters, hiring managers, make their shortlisting decisions based on the contents of your CV. And you may see, well, of course, how else are they going to do it? And that is the message. How else are they going to do it? So if you're sending them a CV that doesn't actually contain the information they'd rather like to have to make a good, effective decision on who to interview, that's it. Game over. You've lost your chance. There is no other way, that, with a few exceptions, which I'll come on to, that they can make that decision. So they don't have a crystal ball that they can gaze into and think, actually, this guy or gal's CV is truly atrocious, but somehow using the magic of my aura and crystal ball, I can see that they actually are a good candidate, so we will interview them after all and give them the benefit of the doubt. Those things just don't exist. So if you send them a pile of rubbish, they'll judge you based on that, and it'll be game over. If you send them a very powerful business case as to why they should hire you, chances are you'll get an interview. It's as simple as that. What are the missing 8%? Well, it's things like the recruiter or hiring manager, most likely the recruiter, might actually know you from some previous encounter. If you're very lucky, they may even be a friend, so that might help. The CV becomes a whole lot less important if you've got somebody batting for you, as it were, somebody who can recommend you direct to the client and say, look, trust me, Mr. Client, this person is really good, their CV is agreed atrocious, but let's not tell them that. Trust me, interview them, it'll be all right. Those things do happen, and if you can make those kind of things work for you, then that's good news. But in most cases, people have to rely on the CV. Some of the other exceptions are things like there's a few people that will just look on LinkedIn, for example, or spot people from there and make a decision. But in most cases, it's the CV that's doing its work. Bad CV, bad results. Good CV, better results. Simple story, really. Final section before I show you a real-life example to try and give you some kind of idea about how we structure this all together. So again, refresher, we opened up with a paragraph about what you are, what you're good at, what's your value proposition. Then we've got a sort of bullet-pointed table with key skills, typically 10 to 14 bullet points, an equal number either side of the page. And then you'll be thinking, hopefully, okay, well, that makes sense. Yeah, we've started to tell a story. We're starting to reinforce certain skills that we might have to give a bit more weight to that story. You'll notice we've still not told anybody on the CV who we're actually working for, and we're not going to be telling them for a little while yet, I have to say. Why is that so? Well, because if you work for a company that nobody's heard of, it's not your best selling criteria. It's not your best sales feature. People may judge you harshly by who you're working for. People may not understand who you're working for and make an incorrect assumption. There's all sorts of things that can happen if you lead with the fact that you're currently with Joe Bloggs PLC as a whatever you are job title. If you lead with that on your CV, or almost it's the first thing that you lead with, again, you're taking a big risk. because the target audience may interpret that completely differently from how you'd imagine. And you just don't know, and you may never know how they're interpreting it. So our argument is, don't tell them who you're currently working for as the first thing on your CV, because it's unlikely to impress somebody. Even if you work for a big company, a well-known brand like a Virgin, a Coke, or a Rolls-Royce, that is, or a BMW, or a Mercedes, or a Apple, you'd be surprised how damaging that can be, but for all sorts of different reasons. And some of them might be people's view of that particular business. You don't know whether they've employed anybody from that business before. If it worked really well, you stand a reasonable chance of getting a good ear, as it were. If it didn't go well, guess what? You'll be, by association, tarred with the same brush. The person's perception of what that organization is all about. Okay, Apple, you could say, well, it's hard to get that one wrong possibly, but there's all sorts of different divisions of Apple, all sorts of different products and brands. Rolls-Royce is in fact two completely separate companies who share a brand name. One's jet engines and military and stuff, one's cars. They're owned by completely different people. So if you don't make those kind of things clear, and we'll touch on this later, incidentally, then you're not helping your cause. And you may be proud of who you work for, and you may know all of the good things that go on, but if you don't get that message across, or you're on the back foot. And more particularly, if you lead with that message, you just don't know how it's going to be interpreted. So we say don't lead with that information. So if your CV starts with that, or it's high up on page 1 at the moment, your most recent or current employer, that's probably something you need to seriously consider about changing. So what do we put in its place? So we started off with this sort of opening paragraph professional summary. We then went to the bullet point key skills. Then we're suggesting if you've started saying about these things that you're actually good at and where you could add value and bring some advantage to the business, wouldn't it be a rather neat idea to actually prove it by way of some kind of case study or something similar? And that's exactly what the career highlights section of the CV is. So it's still page 1. It's still the top half of page 1. About halfway down, actually. And what we're suggesting is that you provide some evidence to back up the claims you've been making, the business case you've been making. Again, this is, as you'll see very shortly, it's important you know a few things. It's important that you can write a reasonably good, concise paragraph, as it turns out, and you'll see in a minute, of something good in your life, career-wise, that can prove the abilities that you started to make claims about earlier on the CV. And we have a nifty way of being able, it's not unique, plenty of people use this acronym, but a nifty way of breaking down what are sometimes complex projects, assignments, events in your life, in your working career, which you want to explain to people, and you might want to explain verbally, but for these purposes we want to get it on the CV. Sometimes you could write a book probably on some of the things you've been involved with, but we don't have the space or the time. So we need to condense all of that into a very small space, about a paragraph. And we use a methodology called STAR, which is situation, task, actions, and result. And I'm going to show you an example of a career highlight. This is actually of Matt Craven, so our boss. And this is a real-life example earlier in his career. ERAC stands for Enterprise Rent-A-Car, just so you know. It's not important, but just so you know. Again, I won't read the whole paragraph, but if you just read through that, the first sentence is the situation. So it's Enterprise Rent-A-Car acquired an unprofitable competitor in the south of England that required transformation. That is the background. Very simple, very clear, very short and succinct. The task is how Matt fit into this particular situation. So he was appointed the operations manager to do some things, basically turn it around. That was his task, the weight on his shoulders, if you like. The actions are then everything between that statement and the last sentence of the paragraph. So there's a number of things that you can see that he did. Exited underperforming staff, recruited a new team, blah, 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 blah. They're the actions. And finally, the result or the outcome is the last sentence. So in this particular case, Matt succeeded in rebranding the business, achieving profitability at a certain level within a certain time frame. Excuse me. So in a paragraph, this thing that took Matt 6 months and probably was quite complex, probably caused him a few headaches and probably a few challenges, but he's been able to explain the key bits of it in a paragraph that will go on the CV. It's enough for somebody to think, okay, this person can actually deliver. It's reinforcing the value proposition. And most people don't have anything near this on their CVs. Most people have a whole list of duties and responsibilities that they have within their job, which often they've just dumped or copied from their job description. Now, if you imagine, if you're in any role, and most people are in a role that can be performed by lots of different people up and down the land, if all you're doing is replicating your duties and responsibilities to your target audience, and all your target audience is seeing is a whole bunch of CVs with the same duties and responsibilities sent in by all sorts of different people at all sorts of different levels, but essentially doing the same job, it really is desperately uninspiring and, more to the point, wholly ineffective, because all you're doing is saying to the recruiter or hiring manager or HR team, I'm a Me Too person again. I'm compounding that by now actually sort of plagiarizing my job description. Employers don't want to see a job description. They want to see some proof of your ability to do the job. The two are completely different. This is a great way of packaging essential information into a really concise style that says, okay, I've just made some claims about what I'm good at. Here's the proof. Here's an example of something I've actually done. Now, in an ideal world, of course, this would be relevant information. So let's assume it is, and we'll come on to that shortly. It's really important that you give some consideration to these career highlights. Bottom comment, again, just to reinforce the fact that there are lots of jobs out there. There's not as many as there used to be 2006, 2007, but they are out there. If you're not getting interviews, it's not because of the economic climate. It might be tougher because of that. There may be more competition. But ultimately, if you've got jobs you can apply for, then you ought to be getting interviews if your CV's up to scratch, and that's the real message. It's important to remember that. A word of caution on these career highlights, as I was beginning to indicate. It's a lot of people, when they leave these webinars, and indeed CVs I get to review. So if you go to our website, you'll see that there's a sort of a free appraisal service, and we take a look at people's CVs as they currently stand and offer them advice. That's open to you guys as well. But I get in probably knocking on for 100 a week, sometimes more. And invariably, if people have had a go at this and thought, yeah, I'm going to give some evidence about how good I am, it's surprising how many times people, first of all, most people don't do it, but those that do it pick the wrong examples. So yeah, they're targeting such and such a job, but the examples that they give of their career highlights have got nothing to do with that. They're things that they were good at, possibly, or that they feel that they did best, or that infused them and excited them the most, that possibly were the most rewarding things they'd ever done, but they're totally irrelevant to their target audience. So there's got to be some sort of common sense applied to this. Pick strong examples, yes, because otherwise it highlights failure. So there's no point talking about things that didn't quite work out, because that's not really going to impress your audience. It must be relevant and targeted. So you've got to be thinking, okay, I'm going for these kind of jobs. The hot skills that these people are going to be looking for, the desirable and the essential skills that these people are going to be looking for are whatever they are. I better pick some examples that fit that well. You'll have noticed on Matt's example, he expressed two things. First of all, he returned that underperforming division to profitability, 10K a month profitability, within 6 months. There's some KPI there. There's no point in focusing all your attention and effort onto things you think are important, and then there's no killer punchline. There's no look at what I've done kind of statistic. Not everybody has those kind of things that they can talk about, in fairness, but how you express it and talk about it can be varied. So don't just ramble on about something and then never give a punchline in terms of what actually was the conclusion or the result. And don't pick weak examples because there is no result. Try and focus on the things where there's some material gain. Remember this business case? somebody was looking to hire Matt when he sent that CV out, they might be impressed with the fact that he was taking an unprofitable business, converting it into a profitable business. He's told them how profitable it became, and he told them how quickly he got it into profitability. They're real things that any self-respecting MD or chief exec would look at and think, yeah, we could do with that kind of experience in our business. If he just said, yeah, I turned the business around, well, what does that tell the individual who's reading his CV? They might give him an interview, but their first question is going to be, okay, you say you turned it around. How long did it take you? And how much was it losing? And then how much profit did it make? There are going to be loads of questions that would need to be asked. If he gets the interview, you could say, well, job done. And in fairness, it would be. But if he doesn't get the interview, it might be because he wasn't giving enough detail in the first place. So really important to make sure they're valid, real, powerful examples, or as best as you can go to market with. Bottom comment, remember, real test for your CV is whether it's getting you to interviews. So always remember that acid test. Finally, we get to the point at which we're going to tell people about what you actually have done in your life and where you've done it. But I did promise, because it makes sense now, to take a look at a real-life example of a CV. So you can get an idea for the figure of it. If you go with me one short moment, I'll flip my screen to CV. Hopefully, shortly you'll see, it's taking a little while to refresh people's screens, so you should all see it now. On the screen there, you've actually got Matt's CV, but the way it's structured, the sort of look and feel of it, so to speak, is exactly how we go to market with most of our clients. There are some exceptions. If you're an out-and-out contractor, and that's all you've ever done, well, not all you've ever done, but if you're a contractor, you're wanting to target contract market, there's a slightly different format that we use for the CV, but the sentiment is the same. So you'll notice here a couple of things. All we've got at the top of the CV is the fact that it's Matt. We've not got the words curriculum vitae. It's totally irrelevant to mention that. It's using up valuable space. There's no point in mentioning it. Anybody who receives this document knows exactly what it is. You don't need to tell people it's a curriculum vitae or a CV. So you only need your name at the top there and how to get hold of you if somebody wanted to contact you. You have a choice. You could have your mobile and home, mobile and office, mobile and email. They're the most important things. Interestingly, observant people amongst you will notice there's no address, and there's some reasons for that I'll come on to later. The address is on the CV, but not in the first page or on the first page. What we have got is this executive summary. It's Matt's in this case, so he's not the finance director example that we saw earlier. It's a slightly different one, but it just shows you same kind of flow. He's telling people exactly what he is, what his value proposition is, the things he's good at. Obviously this is a sort of bit tongue-in-cheek because he's not looking for jobs, but if he were, then the things he's listed would be relevant to his target market, or he'd change them to make sure that it was. Then, although he's called it expertise, remember the key skills or expertise area where the bullet points are. He's listed a number of things that are relevant to his marketplace, which he could quite easily claim and then go on to prove. And they're things that people might search for and therefore would enhance the searchability of his CV and visibility of his CV following a search. And then the area that we've just talked about, the career highlights. So typically we would be looking to put 3 career highlights on a normal CV. Normal meaning for most people. There are some exceptions, but most people, 3 things from your career. Interestingly, it doesn't matter when it happened. This is the beauty of this. You're not tied to chronological order yet. We've not talked anything about Matt's career in the sense of dates and times. I can come on to that in a minute. For the CV's purposes, he could pick examples from any point in his career as long as they're relevant, appropriate, and strong. So this is a great way of being able to pull out stuff that might have happened earlier on in your career, is still relevant, is still powerful, but where most people tend to think, oh, crumbs, I've got to put this on page 4 because it happened early on in my career. Well, no, you don't. You can bring it out and put it on page 1 if it's important, because there's no timestamp as such. We might mention dates and times, but we're not actually saying from X to Y, this is where Matt worked and what he did. We're actually just saying in his career to date, there are 3 things that he's done that he's particularly proud of and that are relevant to you, Mr. or Mrs. Reader of the CV, and here are what they are. And if I just scroll down a little bit further, we'll get all 3 onto the screen. You'll see the middle one of the 3 is that enterprise rent-a-car example. I think most of you got that on your screen now. There's 1 or 2 it's still to pop up for some reason. But anyway, so on page 1, you can see we're 3/4 of the way down page 1, and so we've built a really strong business case for Matt, or Matt's built it for himself. He's explained what he's about, key areas of skills or expertise he has, and then 3 distinct career highlights that explain what he's able to do. Now, it's really hard to get to these, to be honest. This is where we spend most of our time with our clients when we're writing their CV. It's often hard for the individual to think which are the 3 best to go to market with. We help them with that. It's often hard for them to actually think of any examples at all. In some cases, we help with that. We have a process we can go through. And once we've got to which 3 it should be, it's often quite hard to break them down and get to the key milestones. But again, that's what we're here for. If you use a service such as ours, it's to extract all that raw data from people and then represent it in an effective way. As I say, some people leave these webinars and in future hours, weeks, months, days, whatever, set off and write their own CV and then sort of shoot it towards us and say, or they just say, take a look at my CV, and it's instantly obvious that they've tried to apply this style and look and feel to their CV. And some people get it right, and then that works well. Some people get it hideously wrong. We have a struggle then saying, look, you know, I know it sounded easy, but trust me, it's not an easy thing to actually do, particularly if you're not good at writing and wording things in an authoristic kind of a way. So, but I'm just trying to show you it can be done. If you get at the raw material, you can repackage it and make it fit for your needs. But it's a nice, clear, succinct way of explaining what Matt's all about. Now, you'll notice that towards the bottom of the page, which I'll scroll on to now, just at the bottom of page 1, and you'll appear on your screen shortly, so just at the bottom of page 1, you'll see we're now going to say and tell whoever's reading Matt's CV where he's actually been for the last few years and what he's been doing in the typical chronological order. And it is important that it is on page 1. It doesn't have to be any higher than it is, so it's right at the bottom of page 1 in this particular case. And for most of our clients, it probably would be exactly the same when we're writing their CVs. So it is important to be on page 1 because there are some people out there who will automatically jump to the most recent or current employer. They'll just want to look at it. Not everybody by any means, but we know some people do that. And it will be bad if you try to defer this any later than the base of page 1. So going on to page 2 just not a good thing to do because people think you're trying to hide something, or they won't be bothered to turn the page, either physically because they've printed the CV, but more particularly these days electronically. And one of the other important things about this evening is that if you're a recruiter and you've got some kind of aggregating software that pulls all applications together in one place and then allows you to spend a few seconds on each CV judging whether you should interview somebody or not, in almost all cases, not all cases, but in most cases, what you currently see on the screen is about as much as the recruiter will see on their screen via this aggregating software. What do I mean by aggregating software, if that doesn't mean anything to you? If you've applied through Monster and others through Reed and others through Total Jobs and others through IT Jobs or whatever, all of those applications for a job will head into a central pool for most recruiters these days. Not all of them, but most of them. That pool will hold all of the applicants for a particular job and make the CV visible for each applicant via one portal. This is the aggregating software. So the software will say, here's an applicant, this is where the application came from in terms of the job board or advertisement source or publication, Here's the CV, here's any covering note if it asks for one. And sometimes on the right-hand side of the screen for the recruiter will be a red, a green, and a yellow button, literally just like that. Guess what? The red ones reject, and if you're lucky, it'll be programmed to then send you a thanks but no thanks. If you're unlucky, you'll never hear anything again. The amber is might come back to that in a short while, and the green is either, yeah, definitely look at later, or definitely do something with now, an interview. So it depends how they use the system, but it can be that crude. And if you've got to look through 100 or so applications, you've only got time, realistically, to look at what you see on screen right now. The top half, if you're lucky, maybe top third of page one of the CV. So if you think that people are going to sit down with a cup of coffee and consider your document for sort of 10-15 minutes and then pick up the phone and clarify a few things with you, with a few exceptions, that just doesn't happen. It's rapid fire, quick decisions, partly because they know, the recruiters will know that amongst that 100 application there are going to be quite a large percentage of invalid applicants, people who are just time wasters. Maybe that's a harsh judgment. They're applying for good reason, but they stand no chance for whatever reason. They're not going to get any further. And so after a while, if you did that job, you too would take a fairly brutal approach. You just want to whiz through, cut to the chase. The good recruiters will know a good candidate when they see one, and to some degree they'll be able to work around a poor CV. But an average or a bad recruiter, if you want to categorize them as such, they'll not know that. They'll only be able to look at a CV, look out for stuff that they've been told to look out for, and then make a decision based on that. So if your CV gets the message across and has the right content, you stand a good chance. If you've got a bad CV, you're actually a good you could be a good candidate for the role, but your CV just doesn't get that message across. You stand a good chance of being rejected. You'll be frustrated because you'll be thinking, crumbs, I really thought I'd get an interview for that. And it's only the CV that's letting you down, or rather the interpretation of the person doing the filtering of your CV. Either way, it's a rejection, which is frustrating. Okay, so let's just shoot out of there for a minute and come back to the content. We'll come back to Matt's CV shortly. As you saw on the brief bit of career history for Matt that I showed you, bottom of page one, the important thing here is all about the structure of now all this content and how you present it. First of all, as I said, start on page one. That's important. So if you're currently delaying when you tell people about who you're working for or most recently worked for until page two, you need to sort that. That's important. It does need to be in reverse chronological order. Most people do this, in fairness. Every so often I'll get a CV of somebody who started work in the 1980s, and that's the first thing on page one. Absolutely no. I can guarantee you'll get rejected 99 times out of 100. So reverse chronological order, make sure that starts on page one. Going back to my example about Rolls-Royce, Mercedes-Benz, BMW, Virgin, you do, or Joe Bloggs PLC or Joe Bloggs Limited, you need to provide a brief description of who you're working for, even if it's a big named company, and certainly if it's somebody you think pretty much nobody will have heard of. Why? Well, for those very reasons. For the smaller company, it's obvious. You want to give people an idea about the sector it maybe works in, the size of it, the nature of the products that it makes, particularly if any of that stuff is relevant to your target audience. You need to make sure you're explaining to them stuff they may otherwise judge you harshly on. So if they're thinking, well, I don't know who on earth Joe Bloggs Limited is, and I had in my mind a candidate who was working for a big multinational employer, you need to explain something just to give you a bit of a better chance. Conversely, if you're working for a big division, a big well-known branded organization, who's to know what that's going to mean to your target audience? Don't assume anything. As I gave the example with Rolls-Royce, is it the engines, jet engines, or is it the motor car division? Just simple things like that. I'll show you an example of this in a minute. Summary of the role. So what is it that you do? What are you responsible for? Structure of the team that you work in. You don't have to have a team of your own, but you'll probably be reporting into somebody. Tell people who that is. Importantly, how is your role measured, if you know it or have got any measurement criteria? Particularly if you're doing any selling or anything like that, people will want to know what you're measured on, and who judges whether you're doing well or not. Duties and responsibilities to an extent. This is where, again, most people tend to dump their job description in here and assume that everybody will know what's going on. Again, that's a bad indicator. You want a bit of what you're responsible for to give people an idea of scope and scale of your role. But you need to balance it far more aggressively with achievements. So just imagine, as I said earlier, 100 applicants. Let's just imagine for now that they're all valid applicants. It's for let's think of a fairly generic job. Let's say they're a salesman of widgets, whatever a widget is. They're a the job is for a senior salesperson of widgets. All the applicants are salesmen of widgets. They're all looking for their next move up. They want a better car. They want more money, and they've all sent their CV in. Let's just say that some of them work for a small company. They don't explain that it's a small company, so they may miss out because it's not clear who on earth they've worked for. Let's say some of them say they've been selling widgets, but and one of their duties and responsibilities was to achieve targets or meet targets, but then they don't go on to explain that they've actually achieved any of their targets, and if they have achieved them, to what level, and if they've exceeded their targets, they haven't described what level. So that's unclear. Worse still, all they're describing is things that they're actually tasked with doing, which is they're responsible for calling on customers, traveling the country or a region to call on those customers, to sell them widgets, to fill out customer record cards or computer records or database or a CRM system, blah-de-blah-de-blah-de-blah, and to report back to their manager, and to help launch new products. Now you can imagine that most of the 100 salespeople selling those widgets are going to have similar duties and responsibilities. So if you're a recruiter or an employer and you're looking at 100 CVs that claim or paint a picture of an individual group of individuals that are all pretty much responsible for the same thing, which they're likely to be, that's the truth of it, because that is their duties and responsibilities are likely to be very similar, how are you going to make a decision on who to interview? Let's now just assume that one of those 100 has sent in a CV saying, I'm a salesperson of widgets, and over the last 3 years my targets were 100,000, 120,000, 140,000, and my achievements against that were 110, 150, and 250,000. And I did this because I signed a great deal with blah-de-blah-de-blah, and I achieved that because I actually studied the marketplace. Guess who's going to get the interview? The person that's taken the time to say, look, duties and responsibilities are a given. Look what I've actually done with them. This is me. This is what's defined me. This is my sort of proposition to you as an employer. I can earn you money. I can make profits. And here's the proof. Or we're assuming for the moment that it's real, truthful, and can be proven. But they'll get the interview almost guaranteed. So achievements is the focus, not duties and responsibilities. It can be applicable to mention reasons for leaving, but be really careful with that. If you've been promoted to a different role, headhunted, chosen by a former boss, they're good reasons. Pretty much anything else, don't bother. Particularly, you don't want to be saying that you left for more money, or that you've got a track record of being made redundant and you keep putting made redundant on your CV. It doesn't matter what the tale behind that might be, and it might be frustrating for you and entirely truthful and have no reflection on your ability to perform, but all you're sending to your target audience is a message of negativity, and they might harshly judge it as failure, whatever the truth. So it's important to separate the emotional, and this is where people tend to be too close to their jobs. They'll regurgitate the truth and not have an understanding of how their target audience might see it. And if you've got a CV of somebody who seems to have been, and I stress the word seems to have been, promoted or in the right place at the right time, and they seem to have engineered quite a nice career for themselves, against somebody who continually says they've been made redundant, whatever the rationale and reasons behind it, the person getting the interview is the person that's conveyed the positive message. So be very careful what you suggest. I promised some examples. So let's imagine, again, this is a fairly senior finance person. Doesn't matter, everybody can do this. So the little bit about the role is dual role, head of finance and head of IT by the looks of it. Size of the business was X in terms of turnover, Y in terms of number of people, and it was part of the board, so that's a nice little descriptor. Bit about the kind of context of the role, so he managed a number of people in certain functions and oversaw certain functional departmental characteristics like recruitment, blah, 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 blah. So all this would go on the CV. The key deliverables of this particular individual were, and then there's a list of things they were measured against. Further on in the CV, obviously what it would be good to do is then to say, okay, well, if the key deliverables and the KPIs were on certain areas, then the achievements bit would be, how did this person actually do against those criteria? What track record have they got? And so that would build a nice story on the CV, a nice business case, going back to those two important words, a strong business case. Okay, we're going to take a look in a short while again at the CV and how that all pans out in Mac's example. And I promise I'll answer questions at the end of the session. So for those that have been asking them, I will come back to them shortly. We've not got much more to do now. But just quick, what we call a popcorn break, to give me a bit of a breather and to deal with the questions that most likely get asked, so it helps just solve a few things if people need to disappear at the end of the session sharpish. And that's what do we actually do. So you'll have gathered that we as an organisation exist to write CVs, and truthfully, hand on heart, we can materially improve people's chances of getting interviews by writing effective CVs. And if you do use a service like that, then the way it works is that you get matched up with somebody who will write the CV with you and take you through a process that's largely done on the telephone or Skype or whatever, but it's a process done audially, if you like, where we extract a whole heap of raw data from you following a particular process. So we're interested to know, what are you trying to go for career-wise? What have you been doing historically? And then we make a link between the two. And we can sanitize that to some degree. So we're honest enough, and there's not many people out there who will actually say to you, Joe Bloggs, you're heading in the wrong direction, give it up. It's a bit like the Simon Cowell kind of process, which is, he's honest enough, whether you like him or not, he's not honest enough to say, look, it's not going to happen, so deal with it and head in a direction that will be profitable. We're not experts in the sense that we'll get that always right all the time, but we can actually put a level of judgment on it and say, look, this is too big a jump or too big a ask. Either accept that you're going to get a 1 chance out of 100 or move on and do something else. So we can provide that kind of guidance. But the most important thing that we do is to basically represent all that raw data about you. So if you're telling us that you've done X, Y, and Z, then we say, okay, well, what's going on in the marketplace? What have you got to add to that? Is that important? And from all of that raw material, build your CV or business case, as we like to call it, as to why somebody should hire you from scratch. So no fiddling around with aesthetics, no we'll tweak your CV and make it look slightly better. That's wholly impractical and ineffective. It's a complete ground-up rewrite from scratch. And the bottom line is it basically maximizes your chances of getting interest from the people you want to get interested with. Now, at the end of the session, and we only do this on these webinars, there's a special offer so that if you are interested in those services, it's a time-limited offer where you can get a substantial discount on the services that I've just described, and I'll come back to that later. So, so far we've just delved into the career history of an individual whose CV we're writing. So we talked about the opening bit, the bullet-pointed key skills, the career highlights, 3 examples of things that you've done that are good and productive and compelling. Then we started saying, okay, career history-wise, this is what we've been up to. These are the people we've worked with. obviously, if you've got a long career, there's a limit to how much detail you need to put. If you remember earlier, I said, if you've got a 15, 20-year career under your belt, or anything in double digits, truthfully, you don't really need to be giving people a lot of detail about that earlier career on your CV. Doesn't really matter how important it was to you, with a few exceptions. There's just no relevance in going into a lot of detail. So we split the CV, and I'll show you the example again shortly, as I promised. We split the CV into an area which deals with the most recent part of your career and the jobs that you've had, and then a sort of a dumping ground for the earlier career. Not because it's not important and we don't want to mention it, but because it isn't going to affect your chances of getting an interview. The most important thing about your job, particularly in the current climate, is the last few years or months, depending on how old you are, and that's how you'll be judged. So if you did something 20 years ago and you think that's going to get you a sort of key to the door of the interview, it's highly unlikely. You'll be judged on what you've been doing most recently, whether that's right or wrong. That's just where the marketplace is. So most employers set out right now, let's say they describe their ideal person as being a square hole, or the role that they've got is a square hole, then the person they're looking for is a square peg, not hexagonal, not triangular, not circular, but square. And so you need to present yourself as that. And if you can't present yourself as that, you have to accept that you won't get the success rate you might have imagined. So where do we draw the line? Well, by and large, as I've hinted at, it's around that 8 to 10 year level, so double-digit years in terms of career. Any earlier than that, it's just not relevant to getting an interview, with very few exceptions. Or, depending on how many jobs you've had, 4 jobs, which most people have done either a couple of jobs in that 8 to 10 years, but if they've done more than that, you don't really want to explaining much more beyond the 4th job. So there are exceptions to certain special situations, or where people have taken time out or had illnesses or things like that. But by and large, that's a good rule of thumb. So where you've got a career that goes beyond 10 years, what we're suggesting is that you just drop the detail and literally put one line with a date, an employer name and a job title, and use the space on your CV for the productive stuff, which is what are you good at, your most recent career, and the highlights of that career. And you free up a huge amount of space for anybody with more than 10 years working experience. There are some different rules for contractors and interims, which is a different story really, but as I suggested earlier in the session, if you are a contractor or an interim, there's a different approach, not radically, but a different approach to laying out the CV, which I'll deal with either after this session if anybody's interested, or if anybody wants to call me on the numbers on our website. I'm more than happy to deal with that. Again, I'll come back to the real CV in a short while to show you how this all fits together, but I'll just deal with the sections. A lot of people still start with their qualifications on their CV on page 1. Now, if you've just graduated, there is a chance that this may be more relevant, that you'd want to lead with the fact that you've got a certain level of education. But even then, to be honest, you're up against so many other graduates, and unless you've got interstellar levels of qualifications from the absolute top-end universities, it's not something that you're going to win a battle on purely by leading with the fact that you've got a 2-1 or a first, because there are a lot of other people in that boat. So, and if you're older and more experienced, then the examination results you've got become less and less relevant, and you'll be judged on your career to date and who you've been working for and the jobs you've been doing. So mentioning qualifications on page 1 becomes wholly pointless. Doesn't mean to say you can't refer to the fact that you are a graduate, or that you're MBA educated if you have one, or you've got Prince 2 qualifications if that's applicable, or any other generic industry recognized qualifications. You can mention them by name in all sorts of ways, but you don't need to list everything that you've done. You certainly don't need to provide warts and all about the dates and where you've been. So we say further on, towards the back of the CV actually, yes, put education, yes, put professional qualifications, continual professional development, any training courses around that, that's fine. Give the detail of your most recent highest level of education, but no more. So if you've got a degree, yes, where and what subject and what result, unless it wasn't very good, but no more detail than that. You don't, and you're not obliged to put dates. Dates work. They very rarely work well for anybody, actually. If they're too old, guess what? Shouldn't be important these days, but unfortunately still will get picked up by people and used as an indicator, good or bad. And if they're very recent, it might not work for you because people will perceive that you're maybe a bit fresh. So you have to be really careful. So generally speaking, don't mention dates. What people are interested in is the level of education you have, not when you did it, by and large. It's different for IT skills, but that's another subject. I mentioned earlier, when we looked at Matt's example of the CV, he just had his name and his contact details at the top of page 1 of his CV. So what we suggest is you put your personal details, so things like your name and address and bits and pieces, right at the bottom of the CV, or near to the bottom, I should say. Why? For a number of reasons. It shouldn't make any difference to whether you get an interview or not where you live. If it does, it's probably a negative thing rather than a positive thing. So let's imagine you apply for a job, you live in Cornwall, the job's in Glasgow, you want to relocate because your mum lives up there or a relative, or you just want to move. On a CV, you don't normally go into great lengths explaining why you want to relocate. You might put it on a cover letter. You might put it somewhere on the CV, and there's a space and a way you can do that. But by and large, you don't want to go to market with a CV with your address in Cornwall applying for a job in Glasgow, because there's a big danger that somebody looking at that CV will just judge you based on where you currently live, think you're a time waster, think that we're not paying relocation for this role, so why have they bothered, and ditch you. Now, that there could be the wrong reasons, and I think that's a bit harsh, but that sort of thing does happen. So with very few exceptions, there's just no point in leading with your address because it's not giving any added value. What's giving added value is the statement of building your business case, and where you live is not one of those things. So towards the end of the CV, if you've not already mentioned it, obviously make sure you've got an email address there. Driving license can be useful just to avoid any presumptions or assumptions that you have or have not got one. Could be important for some jobs. The Cornwall-Glasgow example that I gave, if you are mobile in the sense that you're able to relocate, you might want to mention something about that here, just a line saying, you know, able to work or looking to relocate to, because just a very brief description to give some sort of evidence as to why you're applying for a job that seems to be several hundred miles away from where you live. So there is a space and a way of doing that. If you've got specific traits, qualifications, eligibilities, accreditations that we haven't already mentioned in the education and professional development area, things like security clearance, if you worked on a government site or in a high security environment, you'd want to mention things like that in this area, and ditto any languages. Again, if you're multilingual or you're really strong in a particular language, that can be mentioned in your professional summary. So you could say, you know, a multilingual project manager as your opening "What am I" statement. So there are plenty of ways of getting that message across. The detail, though, would go later on in the CV. You could put that within the personal details section. And finally, depending on where you're applying for work, if you know there might be a view on whether you're actually eligible to work in a particular country or area, then you'd want to make sure you give the proof. So if you're looking to, I don't know, go out to the States, Canada, Australia, or if you're coming into the UK from a number of places where it isn't automatically assumed, a statement about eligibility could be useful. Almost finally, before we moved on to LinkedIn and take a look at the CV in its whole, just a few general comments. You'll have gathered maybe by reading Matt's example and some of the examples I've given that there is a fairly, what we call a tight writing style, and what you might not have noticed is in what we also call active tense. There's no reference to the words "I did this," "I did that." There's no mention of the individual's name. Some people write their CV as if they're the sort of they're they're talking about themselves, or they've got their friend to write it, and they're saying, Matt did this, Matt did that, Matt has a reputation for, or I did this, I did that, I have a reputation for. It just doesn't work well on a CV, so we always write it in the third person, and as if somebody were looking on you from above high. That's a far more effective way of actually writing the CV. For those of you who don't proofread your CV, make sure you do. Make sure you spell check it and then spell check it again. A lot of recruiters will instantly dismiss your application unless you're absolutely class A, class 1 kind of fit for the job. It's too easy for them to reject CVs with spelling or grammatical errors on them. So obviously make sure that gets sorted. And then the formatting, you'll notice we have a certain style and format to our CVs. They're such a subjective area, but there are some clear things that you ought to do. Don't try and get too clever trying to fit your CV into a certain space. One of the myths, again, another myth, is that people should have a 2-page CV or a 1-page CV or a 3-page CV. There is no rule on how long your CV should be. Generally speaking, it probably ought not to be more than 4 pages is a general accepted fact. It's unlikely to be 1 page, and unless you're specifically asked for that, or indeed any other page length, I wouldn't worry too much about it. What people get wound up about is CVs that don't have any useful information on them at all, whether they're 1, 7, 10 pages long. That winds people up. People who receive a CV that's full of really good information will not quibble as to whether it's 4 or 5 pages, because they'll have probably made a good decision by the time they got to the end of page 1 anyway, so it won't bother them at all. So unless you're specifically asked, don't get wound up about the size of the CV in terms of page length, but don't try any tricks by trying to fill the sheet of A4 with as much as you possibly can cram onto it, because you'll lose readability. When we go back to Matt's example, you'll see that we actually leave quite a lot of white space around the edge of the CV, deliberately so, for a number of reasons I may mention again shortly. Final area of the CV, which again I'll show you when we go back to Matt's example, and copying LinkedIn to some degree. We used to call this testimonial evidence. We now call it recommendations, because a lot of the good stuff that we put on the CV does come from LinkedIn. But you really do want to add any testimonial evidence that you've been given in your life if it's relevant and compelling. And so typically it would come from LinkedIn or appraisals or letters or emails you'd had from from previous employers. Good examples are from bosses, managers who are basically saying, I've worked with Joe Bloggs for a good number of years, or on this particular project, and they really help deliver and make it work for us. I recommend them wholeheartedly. That's good. A bad one is from a colleague, member of your peer group, somebody you go to the pub with every third Thursday of the month, who says, I've known Joe Bloggs, they're really good, always stand around and play a mean game of pool. Okay, stupid example, but hopefully you get my point. Go for the ones that somebody impartially would say that seems relevant and appropriate. Don't go for the ones that look like somebody slapping you on the back and then you're recommending them and they're recommending you, and it's all too pally and covert. We'll talk about LinkedIn in a minute. It is really important, but I'll deal with that separately. And don't put on the bottom of the CV references available on request, because it's wholly meaningless, waste of space. Even if you've listed names and numbers, they're of no relevance. If an employer's got a process, they've got a process. At the appointed time, they will ask you for references whether you've got them available or not, and either the process will grind to a halt if you don't, or they'll find another way around it, or they'll oblige you to fit into their way of working. So just don't bother with it. It makes no difference. It's certainly not going to make the difference between whether you get an interview or not, which is much earlier on in the whole recruitment process, of course. So junk any references to that. Focus on the positive content that might actually get you an interview in the first place. Note at the bottom, for those starting to think about investing in this as a service, it might surprise you that actually it costs a whole lot less than other things you're looking to pay people for or have paid people for recently. So it's an important calculation. You need to start thinking about, if you're going to go down this route, it's an investment, not a cost. And if you get over that hurdle, life becomes a lot easier in terms of thinking about getting some other third party involved in your CV. I promise we'll take a look at LinkedIn, but before I do that, let me just show you Matt's CV in all its glory again, just so we can link up some of those things that we were talking about for the last few minutes. Just bear with me whilst I update your screen. So, a second, I think you've all got it now. Yeah. So, page 1 we talked about, opening summary, bullet points, career highlights, and then the bottom of page, oh sorry, gone a bit quick there, bottom of page 1, you've got the start of the career history. I'll just wait for your screen to refresh. Right, there you go. So at the top of your screen is the bottom of page 1 of the CV, career history. Then flowing into page 2, so you'll see that Matt's taken the time to explain a bit about the company in the slightly shaded area. And then the bullet points start and he's saying what was his role, what was his team, what were his responsibilities, what was his duties broadly. And then as I scroll down, you'll see that he starts to branch out and then suggest some of the things that he actually did. Again, you'll have it shortly. There you go. So you'll see key achievements and assignments, and he's listed what they are. Obviously, they're going to vary from person to person, but you'll see quite a lot of reference to real-life numbers. So increased by 15%, uplifted blah-de-blah by 25%. Did this resulting in such and such a revenue. It's all factual, real-life stuff, answering questions that people would like to have answered. And a lot of people say, yeah, but I'll give all the detail at interview. The point is you might not get to interview unless you provide this information up front. You don't want to give away confidentialities, of course. So if you've got information, you can't give specifics, generalize, give percentages, or give around the region of or in the region of as numbers. But give something to your audience to justify why they should be thinking of hiring you. Now, you see, in Matt's case, he's then gone on, so his CVIA days, CV and interview advisors days were explained just then. And the bottom of page 2 now we're looking at, your screens will be there in a minute. Just wait for them to refresh. Right, so you should have now at the top of your screen the bottom of page 2 of Matt's CV with Hayes PLC. So that's showing a little bit less detail this time round because it's earlier in his career. And as time goes on, this will become less and less as he gets older and does more things. But for Matt, for now, Hayes PLC features a reasonable amount of information. It's still relatively recent in the great scheme of things. But then you'll notice at the bottom of your screen, you'll see earlier career. And I'll just bring this final page up now, the CV. And again, there you go, you've all got it. So, so now you're looking at page 3. Earlier career for Matt, just a line for the enterprise rent-a-car. So now you'll notice here we featured on page 1 something really important in Matt's career, which was that enterprise rent-a-car example where he turned around the underperforming branch. So it doesn't mean to say, you'll see here, it doesn't mean to say just because he did something really important earlier in his career he has to forget about it. He's brought that forward to page 1 and said, look, here's one of my highlights of my career. But in the detail section, there's just a line basically saying, yeah, I worked for Enterprise Rent-A-Car between these 2 dates because it's quite old. The achievement's valid and relevant still, but the actual timing of it is just not important. And talking about what he did in any great detail over 10 years ago, it's just got no bearing on whether he'd get an interview or not. And you have to be harsh about and realistic about these things. Then you'll see his education, where he lives, or would be there to detail, obviously, personal reasons, doesn't want to have his address slapped all over the place. And then a couple of recommendations from people prepared to put their name against what he's done. So in 3 pages, you've got a fairly in-depth level of information about how somebody might get advantage from recruiting mapped. So relatively straightforward process. Actually, quite a while there, you might probably not be surprised, but nevertheless, quite a nice tidy document. LinkedIn, and then we'll almost be done. For those that I think I won't go into too much detail about I'll assume that you do know about LinkedIn. And all I'd say is if you're in any commercial role, and commercial I mean if you're in anything private sector, even some public sector roles, if you're involved in any kind of negotiation, purchasing, selling, organising, arranging, accounting, HR, anything like that, you probably ought to be on LinkedIn. And if you've veered away from it, we speak to a lot of people who are in relatively middle to senior management roles who still aren't on LinkedIn or don't participate, and they see it being as a bit like a sort of a Facebook thing, and they don't like that for those reasons. Then my message would be maybe even if you only use it during a job hunt phase, be on it. You don't have to participate. You don't have to spend your life doing things with LinkedIn, but see it as being a personal website space, and one that you would never be able to outspend in terms of getting visibility on. So it's really important. Recruiters now and employers use LinkedIn heavily. There's lots of features they can buy from LinkedIn for recruitment purposes, and they will now go to LinkedIn before they do anything else in some cases to find talent. And there are some examples, quite a few examples, where people have been found, recruited and hired, interviewed and hired, without anything else having happened. So it's not quite the tipping point, but I'd be saying to anybody now, seriously consider being on LinkedIn if you're not on it. If you are on it already, and you'll know some of this terminology, some of the things people get wrong is one of the things that they just dump their CV on LinkedIn. So if you've got a bad CV, I'd probably argue the case that you're probably better on LinkedIn with at least being there than not on at all, but you're not helping your cause if you've taken just a bad document and slapped it into a mass communicative format like LinkedIn, and let the world see it. You're just sort of multiplying the badness, if such a thing can exist. The other thing is the professional headline, which is a little piece of text that appears under your name. A lot of people LinkedIn offers you the option, and a lot of people select it or type in manually, in effect replicating what they currently are, like their current job title, or they put currently seeking work as a whatever. That's not wholly effective. LinkedIn's great for people who are just sitting around minding their own business, got a heap of skills and abilities, and in an ideal world they're just waiting for somebody to stumble across them and offer them a great job. They might not actually be that interested, but that's the psychology. You really just want to be on there, present, well sorted, well structured, visible, offering or being perceived to offer a range of skills and abilities, but not desperately looking. It's not to be seen as a job board. It's to be seen as your personal web space to promote your abilities. So the professional headline ought to be a replication of the statement on the CV about what you are and what your value proposition is. There's a limit to the size of text you can have in that space, so you have to be quite clever. There's only, I think, 120 characters of space with actual spaces as well, so it's quite tight. But make that meaningful and compelling. Don't make it a replication of what you're currently doing, because that might mean very little to lots of people. There's a summary area in LinkedIn which ought to be similar to our professional summary on a CV. So that's the what are you good at, what's your value proposition. You don't need to be putting loads of detail on LinkedIn. It will encourage you to fill out every field in every glorious way, and will also encourage you, because the more data you put in it, the better your profile appears to be as per LinkedIn's measurement system. So there's all sorts of levels of profile you can have, and the more data you put in, the better your profile appears to be. It makes no difference to its searchability. If you put in a load of rubbish, you'd still get a good result via LinkedIn. Just to indicate the point, you stick a photo in, you get more points effectively, which enhances your profile. But that photograph could be either you, an ice cream or a monkey, it still won't make any difference to the how LinkedIn judges you. It'll still mark you as having a photo, which they'll see as a good thing. So that tells you a little bit about the context. So the most important thing is the content of your LinkedIn profile, not the amount and quantity of content. It's the quality of content. There's an area which most people don't use called projects. They're a great receptacle for our career highlights. So those sort of 3 things we're focusing on the CV that are good achievements in your life, they fit brilliantly into LinkedIn's project section. You can reorder the sections in LinkedIn. So when we're writing the profile for our clients, so once we've done CVs for our clients, we tend to be writing their LinkedIn profiles these days as well, which is part of the service and discount that you can get this evening, interestingly. And we'll reorder those sections to work better and flow better. You can do that yourself if you've got a profile. It's all drag and drop. Most people don't realize that. Now, finally, as far as LinkedIn is concerned, you remember earlier I said that 92, I think it was, % of recruiters and hiring managers will make a decision based on the content of your CV. And I said, well, that's obvious because that's all they've got to judge you on. And at that moment, that's how they don't know about you until your CV, or in most cases, they won't know about you until your CV lands on their desk proverbially or in their inbox. Of that 92%, the vast majority, over 80%, will then check you out on LinkedIn, whether you've got a profile or not. It's not quite at the point where if you don't have a profile, it looks odd, but there are some levels of people, some sectors where I think recruiters and hiring people would think, that's interesting, why aren't you on LinkedIn? So it's almost at that point where I think if you're not on it, you need to be on it. And if you are on it, you'll be getting a lot of hits if you're sending your CV in for applications. People will be looking at your profile. So make sure you've got no obvious differences between the CV and the profile, because it will just raise more awkward questions or give the recruiter or hiring manager an easier decision to reject you, because they could justifiably say to their boss or their client, well, look, I rejected them because there's discrepancies between their details, or just look at their profile, it's a hideous mess, or whatever. So don't make it easy for people to count you. I'm going to tell you something there, but I'm going to move on. So forgive me a moment. So any other questions about LinkedIn? Tap in the questions into the question bar thing you've got on your screen, and I'll deal with them very shortly. Final slide. I promised that we've got some discounts in our services. So for those that are interested in maybe getting somebody else to write your CV, we've got a special deal. It'll only ever be available via webinars like this, so it's genuinely a proper offer. If you go onto our website, you'll see the rate card for these services. For anybody with more than 7 years work experience, so if you've got less than 7 years experience, you need to have a conversation with us, because the deal could, in theory, be slightly better. It's not fair to charge you this price, even though it's a good price. So for those with 7 or years more work experience, if you wanted us to write your CV for you, ordinarily it would cost $299 plus VAT. So it's not an insubstantial amount of money, but bear in mind, for that you'd be getting 2-hour consultation with one of our writers, them writing a CV from scratch, which is a 5 to 6 hour job, plus all the to and froing to sort that out. So you can do the maths, and it adds up. But until week today, you can get not only the CV rewritten, but your LinkedIn profile rewritten for free, in effect, and a free cover letter written for you to either appeal to different types of jobs that you apply for, or speculative approaches to employers, which together would cost a fair penny, and the rate of the CV discounted slightly. So instead of $299 plus VAT, it goes down to $275 plus VAT. So all of those things for $275 plus VAT, which is over £125 discount. It's quite a healthy discount, but it is time limited. So you'd have to act before close of play week today. And to take advantage of that offer, you need to go visit that link which shortly I shall put in the room area, and you can, because you won't be able to interact with the screen as you currently see it. So if you just bear with me a moment, I'll just copy and paste that and then put it in there, and then I shall move on to the questions that you've asked and answer them to the best of my ability. So just copy and paste that link for you. And then for anybody that needs to disappear, then that is the session, and I thank you very much for your time. I hope you enjoyed it, more particularly, and I appreciate the time and attention that you've given it this evening. As I say, if we can be of any help, then you're more than happy to visit our website and take a look at what we've got to offer. Give us a call, and we'll enter into any personal discussions or special circumstances on a one-to-one basis. Meantime, I've just pasted that special offer link into the chat room area, so you should be able to see it. And I will now deal with questions that have been asked in the order that they were asked. So, Cecilia, if you're still there, is there a limit towards how long the summary should be? Good question. Yes, there is. Roughly, I'd say 5 to 6 lines. It does depend a little bit about what you've got to offer the world and how it's phrased, because sometimes even 4 lines seems to be overdoing it. But a modest paragraph, Felicia, is roughly where you ought to be, and that's typically 4 to 6 lines of text in our format. But as ever with these things, it's more what you've got to say rather than the quantity. You also mentioned, I noticed that the summary does not have the names of companies to back the examples. Is this something that should be omitted? Not necessarily, Silly. You mentioned a good point, actually. It's quite legitimate to mention companies that you've worked with if it helps your cause. So if there are particular companies that you've done work for that are generically known, like for example, this is probably not right, but let's just imagine that you are an expert on vacuum design, vacuum hoover design, a domestic vacuum cleaner design. If you'd mentioned that you'd worked for Dyson, that would mean lots of things to lots of people, or even Hoover. So that would be entirely appropriate. So no, there's no harm in mentioning company names at all. Would this format be permissible for a legal CV in trying to get a training contract where a CV is accepted? Loosely, Felicia, yes it would, but there are some things about a legal CV that are slightly different, particularly when looking to get a training contract, and they do focus around the kind of experience that you've got and the evidence to back it up to justify why somebody might want to take you on, as it were. So that's probably something worth having a separate conversation about. But yeah, we've written quite a few legal CVs for people trying to get training contracts, and you're right. One of the things that is the same is the focus on the evidence to support your competencies and experience, rather than leading with just say your qualifications and training to date, because lots of people will be having a similar level of without knowing your background, I would imagine lots of people will have a similar level of education who so could go to market with similar levels of, I've been to such and such a university or college, I've done such and such a level of qualifications to date, and I might have a certain amount of experience, and there'll be lots of people who could claim all of that. So what we need to draw out is the kind of work that you've been up to, the cases or any kind of involvement that you've had by association or whatever, that helps to justify things that you've done which are a little bit different. And I think that's about it. So I'll hold on for a couple more minutes, but for those of you who want to go, then again, thank you very much for your time. Hope you enjoyed it. Best of luck going forwards. If you're interested in the offer, don't remember it closes week today about this time, give or take. Close of play, which is strictly speaking 1 minute to midnight week today. But if we can be of any help, just visit our website, give us a call, drop us an email, and we'll come back to you and talk on a one-to-one basis. And as I say, tomorrow you'll get a link to a recording of this webinar, which you'll be able to re-review should you wish. And I'll sign off now, so I'll say good night, and within the next sort of 30 seconds or so I'll shut this down and disappear from the ether, and wish you all the best. Thank you.